In this video, we're going to look at the big picture of the Bible before we get into more of the context and the specifics of different books in the Bible. So for some reason, the Bible is often picked apart or read in small chunks, and it's read in isolation from the rest of the book or the rest of the Bible. And this isn't a great way to go about reading it. It leads to, or can lead to, a misunderstanding of what the text means, and even a misapplication sometimes. So in this video, I just want to kind of highlight how the Bible is one big book, or actually a collection of many books, and show how looking at the overall story of the book is first important before diving into one of the books or a portion of one of the books. So there are 66 books in the Bible, and Bible actually just means book. So 66 books that makes up this collection that we call the Bible. They were originally, all these books, the 66, were originally written and published on some level. They were all written separately. So it wasn't as if just a single author sat down and started writing books and that got compiled. It was actually written by many different authors, which we'll get into. So there are two sections which make up the Old Testament and the New Testament. And so we'll talk a little bit. I know this is a New Testament class, but it's helpful to have a good idea of what is within the Old Testament. So within the Old Testament, there are 39 books. And don't make the mistake, if you do read the Old Testament, of reading it as if it is all completely chronological. Actually, it's more organized by theme or by type or genre. So there are 4 genres in the Old Testament, and that is law, history, poetry and wisdom, and prophecy. Okay, and we'll have a separate video that details more about these genres, but that's just kind of an introduction. Okay, so the Old Testament and New Testament combined, they were written over the span of about 1,500 years. Combining the Old and New, there were roughly 40 authors, and these authors were spread across 3 continents and wrote in 3 languages. So it's actually pretty crazy to see how such diversity is present and how that has been combined into one single book that we have today. And actually that will be a lecture later this week on how we got the New Testament that we have today. So it took several centuries to get the Bible collected into the one book we have today. As I mentioned earlier, it's not like someone sat down and wrote in their notebook. It was much different then. And so it took quite a while, a few centuries, of gathering these individual books together to form the one book that we have today. So the Old Testament was complete about 200 years before the birth of Jesus Christ. And then the writing of the New Testament was complete not long after Jesus died and rose again. And it took a few centuries after Jesus' death for the early church to come to a consensus of what made up the canon, which we will also talk about. But by about 300 AD, we had a consensus on what the books of the New Testament were, which were the completion of the Bible as a whole. Interestingly, just a few facts on the Bible, there are more copies of the Bible handwritten than there are any other book that's ever been written. And then since the printing press was invented, the Bible has been a best-selling book every single year, which is crazy. So a little bit about the Old Testament. It is mainly dealing with the story of God's relation with his chosen people, and that was the nation of the Israelites. So God chose this people group through a specific family, which would be Abraham and his family. He identifies this family, and the nation comes out of that family, and they are the Israelites. They are his chosen people that he makes a covenant with. And so throughout the Old Testament, we see the story of this up and down relationship, how the Israelites are not always faithful to God's covenant, and what happens as a result of that. And so that is all kind of laying the foundation for the New Testament, where we see the new thing that God does through the person of Jesus. And he is the main character of the New Testament. So one thing to note is between the Old and New Testaments, there was a period of about 400 years where God does not interact with his people. There is basically silence. And so the people are a little lost and are not following God in the way that they should. So then turning to the New Testament, the New Testament is comprised of 27 books, and it actually also has 4 genres. And those 4 genres are Gospels, history, letters, or what we call epistles, and then apocalyptic. And we'll get into what all of those genres are in a later video. So basically, the New Testament gives us a history of the beginning of the religion of Christianity through the early church. So in the Gospels, we get accounts of who Jesus was and what his ministry was while he was on earth. And then we see out of the Gospels, kind of what happened next. So Jesus died and rose again, and then what? And that's what a big portion of the New Testament details, is how the early church was born and how it went on to spread the message of Jesus, not only to just the area of Israel, but across the world. So yeah, like I said, Jesus is the main character of the New Testament, and you'll see that all throughout as we study. Another major thing is Paul, the Apostle Paul, is one of the primary authors of the epistles. He authored 13 of the 21 epistles. So yeah, that is just a brief overview of what the Bible is, if you're not familiar. And then in the coming video, we will talk about those 7 or 8 different genres that we find within the Bible, and how important they are when you're reading and trying to understand what it is that you've read.